All right, so we just learned about the 4 subfields, and now we're going to talk about what do they share in common. So we have cultural anthropology, remember, archaeology, biological, and linguistic anthropology. So these 4 subfields, what do they all share in common? All right, so I asked you at the end of the last video, the last question was to think about how the fields overlap. How do they work together? And so here, I just really like this diagram. It comes from the face-to-face textbook that we use on the Landmark campus. Okay, so when we're looking at this, cultural anthropology is here, obviously. So this is what we're studying in this class. But you can see that it does overlap with biological, it overlaps with linguistic, it overlaps with archaeology. Okay, so what did you all come up with? What do you think? So my favorite example, it falls in this area. This is going to be primate conservation. So the overlap of cultural anthropology and biological anthropology. So we can study animals, we can study chimpanzees, for example, we can study humans, and we can see how their cultures are similar. Do animals even have culture? And then how can we use that information we gather from both chimpanzees and from humans to create really holistic, solid, mutually beneficial conservation programs? Because that's my favorite example. There are a ton of other examples, and if we've got some good ones, I'll share them with the class at our weekly wrap-up video that I'll do. Okay, so hopefully you guys come up with some good examples. Keep thinking of them. You can always come back into this guided learning activity and throw in some more examples. That will help you when you're studying because you will have access to these. Okay, so if you think of some more good examples, come back and throw them in there so that I can see them, so you can remember them, and we can share them with the class. So anthropology is an interdisciplinary field. Okay, it's united by the following concepts. So culture, cultural relativism, diversity, change, and holism. These are talked about in your text, but also some of these come from outside. So be sure that you are reading the text and watching these videos and keeping up with both, because you'll have overlapping but some new information from each one. Okay, so let's just work through these one at a time here. Culture, and I love this quote, culture is like water to fish. So what do you think that means? Culture is like water to fish. Okay, so we're thinking about water to fish is their everything. Right? It's what they are, it's what they live in, it's what they experience the world through. Without water, they're nothing. Okay, so I like to think that that's how culture is. Okay? It's a very similar process. Okay, so the term culture we're thinking about is this taken for granted notions, those rules, morals, and behaviors, okay, that feel very natural. So everything we do within our culture feels very natural, and that's where we fall into a bit of ethnocentrism, which we'll get to in a moment. But culture is everything that feels very natural to us in our world. It's been an integral part of anthropology since the very beginning. An anthropologist, E.B. Tyler, so he came up with the first term of culture in the 1870s. And when we do our chapter on culture next week, we'll get more into how do we define culture. So I don't want to do that here. I don't want to have you watch me talk about it now and then watch me talk about it later. Okay, so just remember the name E.B. Tyler. He's a very important anthropologist. Okay, he gave up the first term of what culture is. But really it's just, again, those taken for granted things in our culture that feel very natural, feel very real, like the way things are supposed to be. And all of the 4 subfields are united by this culture concept, the concept of culture. While we might not all agree exactly on the perfect definition of culture, we all use a very similar working definition of culture, and it plays an important role in what we're studying. Ethnocentrism. So like I said, culture are those things that feel very, very real to us, that feel very natural, as if that's how things should always be, right? There should always be a mom and a dad, right? Or there should always be a nuclear family with mom, dad, and kids, or 2 parents and kids, or the grandparents should always live in the home with you. Things like that feel very natural. We can include things even that we eat, right? We have very strong feelings across cultures about what we eat, what is good to eat, what isn't good to eat. And you can go somewhere else and they'll eat like shark fin or rotting meat, and that seems disgusting, right? That doesn't seem good to eat. And so that feels very natural to us, just like eating those things seems very natural to people in their culture. Okay? So that can make you fall into this trap of ethnocentrism. So that's the assumption that one's way of doing things is correct, and it has you dismiss other people's practices or views as wrong or ignorant. Your book defines it as the practice of viewing the cultural features of other societies in terms of one's own. Okay? So it's not accepting another culture, trying to understand another culture. It's just assuming that your way of doing things is the best way to do them. Right? And so anthropologists have to be really, really careful we don't fall into this trap. Okay, it can provoke intolerance, like you see here on the screen, and it can make cross-cultural understanding impossible. Okay, so as anthropologists, we are put in situations that are uncomfortable maybe for us, okay? Or seeing cultures that are very different or very strange seeming, right? But we have to be mindful of that and to try to practice cultural relativism. So this is the principle that helps us avoid ethnocentrism. So this is the moral and intellectual principle that one should withhold judgment about seemingly strange or exotic beliefs or practices. Okay, this doesn't mean that you can never have an opinion about something. So some people will take this really far and they'll fall into the realm of moral relativism, which is different. But they'll assume that anthropology suggests that any behavior that happens in a culture has to be written off as part of that culture and can't be judged, it can't be seen as immoral or wrong. Okay, so then they'll say things, well, like, then you must accept genocide because it's part of their cultural tradition. Well, we are able to, as anthropologists, make decisions about behaviors that are appropriate or inappropriate, dangerous or safe, things like that. It's just that first you must understand the culture from its own perspective, from the emic or insider perspective. That's what this principle really says. It doesn't say you have to adopt all cultural practices or you have to personally believe that all cultural practices that exist in the world are great. Okay, it just means that you have to withhold your judgment until you understand why that behavior or practice occurs from that own cultural perspective. And this can be very difficult, but this is one of those things I think we all can apply to our everyday lives. A little bit of relativism can go a long way in working with other people, even within your own culture. So then diversity. Okay, so one of anthropology's major contributions, one of the things anthropology really gives to academia is describing and explaining human diversity. Just the huge amount of ways that you can be human around the world, right? Okay, so in anthropology, if you hear me say diversity or difference, we really shouldn't use the word difference. So diversity refers to multiplicity and variety. Okay, so there can be similarities, there can be differences, there can be the exact same practices within this term of multiplicity, diversity, and variety. So when you hear me say difference, that's kind of a slip of the tongue. We really should try to use the words diversity, multiplicity, and variety, which I do try to use those, because that encompasses both differences and similarities within cultures. All of the four subfields understand that culture changes. So those four first lines there are showing you just some examples. So cultural anthropology can study how religions change, how economies change. Archaeology might look at environmental change that you can see on the record. Could look at political change as well. Biological might look at genetic change or evolution. And linguistics can look at the formation of new languages or how our language adapts. So the introduction of new slang, how we use language differently between age groups, things like that. Okay. And then as new topics and issues in our world emerge, anthropologists are really good about jumping right on those topics and on those issues and starting to study them. Okay, we don't wait 5-10 years to start studying something because by that point it's already changed. So anthropologists really have to keep up with what's going on in the world so we can be right on top of those issues and be ready to lend a hand as best we know how. So then anthropology as a discipline, it started out, as most academic disciplines did, by white males, coming up with the theories, doing the work, those sorts of things. But now anthropology is increasingly practiced by people of all races, colors, creeds, genders, sexes, things like that. So anthropology is becoming really, really, really inclusive. We're starting to see indigenous groups adopting practices of anthropology and becoming anthropologists in order to advocate for their communities. But this concept of change really is just that culture is always changing, and things are always going to be changing, and anthropologists really embrace that change. And then holism. So this studies combines all the aspects of human life. So it's trying to understand culture from all different perspectives. Okay, so this includes personal histories, cultural histories, social life, language, biology, kind of incorporating everything together. So even if you're studying biological anthropology, or even if you're studying linguistics, you're still going to include other aspects of the culture. While you might focus on one specific aspect, let's say language, you're not going to exclude socioeconomic status and its influence on language. You're not going to exclude economic influences on how we use our language. Okay, so it's very holistic. Okay? And that's because humans are holistic. I'm not made up of one piece, and you aren't either. Right? Humans are built from a lot of variety and a lot of different perspectives, and kind of blend all that together to create a person, and then those people blend together to create a culture. So a holism is just the effort to synthesize these approaches into a single comprehensive explanation for any one behavior, any cultural practice, or things like that. Perfect. So then how do anthropologists know what they know? This is going to be our next section, so answer the questions below, and then we'll move right on to thinking about how do we figure out these things about culture.